I wanted to start. You have your own podcast. It has a really interesting name. I love the name of your podcast. Do you mind telling anyone watching this what that is?
Sure. Shit you wish your building did.
Yeah. How did you come up with that name? Is that was that a placeholder that you never replaced? Or it's just like that gets to the heart of the message you're trying to get
Yeah,
to?
a little bit. Yeah. Like, I don't know. Sometimes, you, I mean, I've spoken to people, I'm sure you speak to clients, and they always said like they'll have people who will come to them and say, "Oh, I'd like my building to do this," or like they've gone
Yeah.
and seen something and they're like, "Oh, can we have that?" So that kind of like, it was a bit like that, like,
Yeah.
the things that people are doing that you wish were being done in your building.
And
That's
I
kind of,
see it's such a small statement, but I see so much meaning in it. Even like as a vendor that provides smart building solutions, there's
yeah.
things I wish our clients did, right? It's not just things that they might wish for. There's things I would love to see. There's barriers that I still can't break because maybe there's process or vendors that don't talk to each other that get in the way. There's always going to be, I think that statement in our projects as well as across the industry. Like there's things I wish this building could do, but
Mm.
we can't do it because of many complicated reasons and not always as straightforward as a lack of technology. It can be many things. Um, well, let's back up a little bit. Do you mind just doing a quick intro of yourself and what you do?
Sure, of course. Name is James McHale. I run basically an analyst company. So we write research about technology, specifically smart building technology.
And as far as I know, it's one of the longest running uh, websites and research groups I've seen in this niche. And even before maybe there was some of the terminology around this.
Well, yeah, I would definitely predate prop tech. I know that for a
Yeah,
fact.
yeah,
But yeah, I think, I've been doing this quite a while now. Yeah, it kind of creeps up on you. But yeah, I think probably smart buildings, as a term, has been around for as long as I've been going. Yeah, I remember when first starting, people didn't really talk about that. It was more of intelligent buildings or green buildings.
yes,
And, it's funny, isn't it? Because these kind of terms kind of come into the public consciousness and then go out of it. And then everyone comes up with a new marketing term. So,
yeah,
yeah, we've seen a
yeah.
bit of that over the
It's
years.
interesting that the trend, that the phrases that help people understand, what we do in our industry, and even like what explaining things to your family or friends at dinner party. Um, I often like I would say maybe 10 years ago when I first started, people assumed that everything we were doing was about green buildings. And at the time and for quite some time in our business, it maybe had a little bit of energy consumption reduction or as a focus, but most of the focus was about user experience. Um, that's harder to explain to people outside the industry how some really basic fundamental problems exist and people take for granted how hard it is to achieve some really frictionless user experience. Uh, but what I've seen come full circle is, well, now that when people say, "Oh, you must do a lot with energy and green buildings," the answer is yes. All of a sudden, everyone's interested in that, and it's like the number one priority. And if the consequence is also user experience improvements, then that's great as well. Are you seeing, in general, right now, more interest in smart buildings than ever before? Are you seeing more growth with your content consumption, for example, because it's such a hot topic?
Well, I think two things there. I mean, obviously, in general, absolutely. Like, I think I've never seen more interest in applying technology, to the built environment from the investor perspective, from the end user
Yeah,
perspective, from the companies. Like, there's a lot more companies now in this space and, actively trying to sell software or some services and hardware than for a long time, and they bring a lot of energy. So I think that's great. It really feels like there is something here. But yeah, I mean, from our perspective, yeah, the business is growing, but because it's slightly different, people come to us if they want to understand certain things, or if they want to, you know, get some research to kind of put together a business case. And so yeah, we are seeing more inquiries and more interest. And I think as a business, like as an industry, like what we've seen for a few years, but increasingly, I think there's like people come from like the periphery. So you've always had this kind of like these core businesses that are produce systems in buildings, right? But then you've got more of the IT companies coming in. You've got like the property companies coming in and seeing these kind of opportunity to sell software because they all like the
Yeah.
margins.
Uh, I've seen in my career in smart buildings just the complexity of choice and there's no real dominant player in many of this technology stack within a building,
Mm.
and there's it's hard to get through like what interconnects what is tied into its own ecosystem, what's the right technology for the challenge, what is even the challenge we're trying to solve in the building. It's a very complicated area, and it's only increasingly getting more complicated. Um, are you finding any sort of consistent challenges across your various stakeholders that would be reading your reports?
Funny you should say that, John. we just did a white paper on this kind of stuff, right? We kind of came up with this question about what is holding back mainstream adoption of smart building technology. And ultimately, some of the consistent things that you see is that it's not really a technology problem. Like the technology exists to make buildings, to optimize buildings, to make them more efficient, to improve the user experience. It exists now.
Yeah.
It's much more really about the what I would call, like structural problems in the way that things are delivered, and also the way that the way that companies are set up internally. And what you're basically dealing with, right, is a really old kind of construction. Property is like an old established business, and it's trying to digitize, and it's trying to have this transformation. And yeah, it's not that easy, right? And yeah, I 100% agree, right? It is it is complicated. You can't underestimate the complexity of thing. Like go into any commercial building and just look in the ceiling, right?
Yeah.
There's a lot of stuff, and yeah, it's not easy to manage and operate that.
Yeah, and I feel like there's so much compromise and that's been made along the life cycle of the building, which is a long life cycle. Even the design construction process
Mhm.
is sometimes a decade from initial concepts design or
Yeah.
tendering the site for applications. Like that's a long time to like make things complicated. I feel like I mentioned it before. It's not a technology problem. It's more a process problem. And I've seen our best examples at Place OS is when um, the tendering suits our technology, which is often rare, to achieve like to make the building do the shit that you want it to do. The tendering process often gets in the way,
Mhm.
and in some on one building project we might have to bid for multiple tenders and might win one out of five, uh, and maybe not
Mhm.
the one we thought we were going to win, and there's no way to break into these other user experiences, for example,
Mhm.
and other vendors like us are in the same position, and
Mhm.
it's really like what technology people might find quite boring, but a change management process that needs to get into the industry and really look at the processes of interacting with technology, and particularly interacting with startups and scale-ups that often have the solutions to these
Mhm.
complicated problems. But the nature of these building projects and these enterprise customers, they don't really know how to work with those types of companies, and often do things that like just make the project less successful from day one. Um, you mentioned the investment side of things as well. How is that one of your key audience stakeholders? Are they reading your reports, trying to understand prop tech because maybe it's new to them?
I not so much actually. It's more and more like we definitely do get investors reading things that we publish. I'd say the main kind of group of stakeholders or people that like we interact with more of sort of definitely vendors, definitely consultants, systems integrators, real estate companies,
Yeah,
those kind of guys, end users as well. More like definitely getting conversations and some clients who are have their run their own property function, right, have their own facilities management and want to do buildings better, right.
yeah,
Yeah, but
yeah,
no, I mean
and
go on, sorry.
the real estate companies are, many of them are well, they're service companies, and technology and services go together,
Mhm.
um, and many are getting very active in the technology space, and particularly prop tech. Um, I know you have a research note on JLL as an example, uh,
Mhm.
investing, acquiring, or partnering with technology companies. Um, do you think though, it's just as an example, it's just making things even more complicated? Like, do I buy my technology uh, from the real estate service provider? Um, what technology do I buy? They seem to have 4 or 5 apps that sort of have do the same thing, or at least have workplace in the title. Um, what about, like, where else do we go to get this type of
Mhm.
technology? Do we go to a telco? Because but that's not really what telcos establish themselves as. Like, even just knowing where to turn for technology is I think very hard for the end user, and in particular the workplace tenancy, because it's such a there's so much consistent problems, but there's so many competing solutions that it's all just a mess. And another point of that, what do you think needs to happen to make it less messy?
Ha. Okay, some good questions. I think first, like, I think it really depends. It's about perspective a lot of the time, right? I don't. There is never going to be one size fits all kind of solutions for building technology. So I think it makes a lot of sense. Like if you're renting space from a property company and you have some kind of lease, I don't know, 10, 15 year or less lease, I think it makes quite a lot of sense actually, but
Yeah,
to go to that property or that property company to upsell you on the technology. Okay, so you come in, you say, okay, I want to take a floor and I want okay, how about this? How about we put in a nice access control system for you. We'll give you the and we'll give you the solution to be able to look at occupancy and manage your space. And I think that's quite compelling,
yeah,
especially if you're like a medium-sized company that doesn't have the bandwidth, right, to like really get into the weeds of this kind of stuff. But if you're a much bigger company and a bigger workforce, and maybe you're even owning your own property, then you're going to go down a different route, and you'll probably will invest more time in really understanding and going and speaking to more vendors and stuff. So in
yeah.
that sense, it doesn't work so well for them.
Yeah, and it's like the two different ways to scale, like the horizontal and the vertical. Like a workplace is unique because it's often multinational, and they
Mhm.
might be leasing from many different landlords and have many different service providers for their real estate. So that, I mean, there's an ideal that a software as a service model could easily fit into um, the rental model of per square foot, you could just have like an extra few dollars on top of that for the technology. Um,
Exactly.
but the scaling that multinationally across other buildings, and then also thinking about how does this come into hybrid work in other areas,
Mhm. Mhm. Mhm.
particularly for that workplace vertical.
Yeah.
Um, it's just not easy.
No. And like, I think your second question around, sort of the messiness, right? Or the let's call it the I don't know, vendor kind of, well, there's just so much it's very difficult to describe, or as a vendor to be able to differentiate yourself on the market. And I mean, I think that will sort itself out. I think, what we'll see is consolidation in the market, and we're already
Yeah,
seeing um, you of kind of rolling up of services into packages, and actually, so I think there will be an element of that kind of sorting itself out. But yeah, I think it is a challenge. It's a challenge on both sides. It's a challenge for customers to really understand what they're getting, right, and feel confident about what it is and what the cost is. And then also on the vendor side to be like, differentiate yourself from the competitor, to be able to say, look, we've got something really compelling and different here that you want. So yeah,
yeah.
no, it's like a challenge with technology in general, I think sometimes.
Yeah, I think that the unique part with smart building and prop tech right now is that there's so many different types of uh, providers, and like, to transition to one of my points I wanted to discuss with you is like the role of big tech like Microsoft and Google and Cisco um,
Mm,
in the prop tech and smart building space. It's just another it's another option which you might not think to go to for these types of solutions. But um, the tricky thing is there's so many stakeholders in a building that maybe each stakeholder has their usual method of purchasing technology, um, and that might be conflicting with the other stakeholders within the same organization going
mm,
to their usual method of purchasing technology.
mm,
So, for example, like the IT, in smart building, and again in smart workplace, often it's someone from IT, someone from facility management, and someone from human resources or some sort of business unit. Each of those will have their own supply chain. The IT person might turn to Microsoft or Cisco. The HR person might look at some cool startups to bring in that can solve some HR problems at the same time, but also do some of the features that they might be
mm,
looking at elsewhere. So I think that's a unique challenge in smart building. It's probably just um, comes down to so many different types of stakeholders, um, and it being such a niche and complicated problem. It's you can't just like put little thought into it. It can't just be like, oh, what should we buy for this problem? Let's research for an hour and find out. Um, but you have another good research note on Microsoft in particular, and so they're heavily moving into this space. Do you want to talk on that a little bit?
They have a lot of, they're a big property owner, massive campus in Washington State in the US, and they do a lot of like pretty innovative stuff for their own property portfolio. And there are lots of case studies out there that have been published, I think, about what they do and how they optimize their own buildings.
Yeah,
So that's kind of one side of it, and then the other side, as you said, sort of what are they bringing to market? And yeah, they've just launched or will be launching, I think, next year, a kind of hybrid work um, solution, which they're calling Places. And yeah, it's very going to be, I think, very interesting to see how that works out. I mean, if we look at sort of like, how they kind of bring things to market, they tend to bundle these software and part of the enterprise package. And they did that with Teams, and they did that extremely effectively. And if you look at now how many daily active users are on Teams, I mean, it's incredible. So I
yeah.
think,
I think I wrote that down after reading the report. It was
yeah,
20 million before COVID and 270 million
yeah, right.
today. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's in a few years. And that's the thing. I think they have the scale and the power just to move markets.
Yeah,
Not a lot of companies have that. And so I think as a workplace, as a hybrid workplace offering, if they bundle that with their other enterprise and go that through that channel, which I highly suspect they will, then it will have a big impact, I think, on workplace
yeah.
software.
Do you think they're in a way now competing with their partners? They're moved into a niche field where some of the promise of being a cloud provider is you're the infrastructure layer for people to build their applications on. Where
Mm.
here they're sort of getting into this niche application delivery.
Mhm.
I wonder how the industry and the market will take that,
Yeah, yeah.
and if they'll
No,
see it
that's
as
great.
a threat or an opportunity.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're not going to do everything. Okay, so I think the hybrid work. I mean, it totally makes sense, right? They're already managing people's calendars. They're already managing the meetings and the kind of the interface between people. So to extend that and then to create this kind of uh, environment where people can understand where each other is and who is working from home, who isn't, and then they're already announced a whole bunch of partners, so
Yeah,
they'll be partnering with to provide some of the other functionality. And as you rightly mentioned, like the cloud, if you that's one part of it, then there's the cloud Azure part of it as well, where they're really it's more about providing the infrastructure, and then they've partnered with other companies to actually provide the solution. And I don't
yeah,
think they're going to go down. Like, I mean, Microsoft are not going to be a access control company or a
yeah,
building automation, building management system company. But sure, they want to provide the cloud infrastructure for that. Absolutely.
yeah.
I think
Go
they
ahead.
see the hybrid work thing as just an extension of what they're already doing. I
Yeah,
think that's probably the differentiation.
yeah. A- And with some experience myself working with Microsoft and with similar large companies, I know that they're very department driven. So uh, like the people selling cloud consumption of Azure, that's their focus, and
Mm,
they don't care if it's Microsoft's product or a third party product that gets their customers on the cloud. And similarly across other departments. And
mm,
so I
mm,
think that's where they're different because it's not their focus.
mm,
Well, smart building is not their focus. Hybrid work is.
mhm.
So I personally feel like PlaceOS see this as an opportunity because it's something we can obviously tie into and extend the features beyond the workplace into the building.
No, 100%. And there will be, I think that'll be a great platform for people, for companies as well to leverage. Yeah.
The risk that I see with this and the challenge I think for smart building in the future, and I'd like to see if you agree with me or have some comments on this, is that it could the what I was calling the messiness might go away with some of these larger players coming in and consolidating things.
Mm,
Um, but then they might be creating their own lock-in ecosystem similarly to what we have in the home market right now, where you sort of have to choose, is this a Google Home? Is this using Nest? Is this an Apple Home? Or is this an Amazon Alexa home? And then build that as your ecosystem that you sort of tied into once you start. Um, I would hate to see that in commercial buildings uh, where now it's either a Microsoft building or a Google building or an Amazon building or whatever
mm.
become the consolidators of this. Do you see that as a risk? Do you think this might happen, or is it bound to happen because we've already seen it play out in smart homes, and maybe smart home is just a little bit ahead of commercial buildings?
This problem of vendor lock-in is not new to building systems, building
Yeah,
technology markets. It's going back, a few years. It was quite it happened a lot. I think that the companies were locked into some of the bigger suppliers. And look, some of these bigger companies as well build up massive legacy portfolio of equipment out there, and they make a lot of money from maintaining and up retrofitting and servicing those contracts. So I think that recently, there's a lot more talk, a lot more understanding of the benefits of not just open communication protocols like BACnet, which is pretty established now, but now also about open data models as well.
Yes.
So that's great. That's encouraging. I think there's more awareness now of like the data needs to be open. We need to be able to get data out of our system. We should own the data, and then we can decide then what we do with that data ourselves. But yeah, I think they definitely have to be careful about that. And it's a lot to ask for a company, right? It's something that this isn't, what building technology is not their thing. They just have a building and they just want to make it work properly, and to be able to avoid all these pitfalls is tough. It is tough. But so yeah, there is some danger in that, but I don't think it's really changed too much. It's always been there, right? So
Yeah.
the threat of vendor locking still exists.
Yeah, I mean, I think if anything, it's getting, well, it's much better than it used to be, right? Like it's there's companies that you wouldn't dream of getting access to their data that now have open APIs, and that's great to see. It's easier to integrate with things. I would just hate to see it go backwards when, as a consequence of the consolidation that's likely to happen in the industry.
No, so would I.
Um,
Yeah, I mean, to draw an analogy with, one of the areas we also look at is security. So electronic security, like video surveillance. And yeah, it's kind of with that, it's gone through quite a lot of cycles of innovation. It started off as CCTV, like closed circuit television, so like analog cameras on these kind of closed networks, and then it evolved to much more of an open IP based infrastructure. And now what you're seeing is a cloud has come more in, and you are again seeing these kind of closed systems, closed environments forming up again. So yeah, it's kind of interesting.
Yeah, it's sort of it changes, and even my thinking changes on this sometimes. Where, for example, with PlaceOS, when we used to start, when we're integrating with sensors, we often say, well, integrating with the sensors the wrong way of thinking of the problem. You might want to locate a user. The sensors maybe not the best way. There could be something else to integrate with. And when we had to integrate with a sensor, I used to always try to specify sensors that we could talk directly to from our cloud service to the sensor. We're now sort of flipped 180 on my thinking on that, where it's more secure for us to talk to a cloud service and they're talking to the sensor. So sometimes it makes sense for a particular vendor to manage the security and the implementation of particular device communication, and expose like a nice simple API to third-party vendors like us. It's really having a good reason to have it locked down to an extent. So you don't want to expose every single device to a third party, which could open up vulnerabilities. But if not opening it up stops a particular user experience from happening, and that's when it needs to be considered.
Right, exactly. Because let's be honest, like, I mean, it depends what you want. Like, if you're a smaller company and you want, like, you just want to, maybe you, like, again, to use maybe the video surveillance analogy, like, if you just want, like, a system that's kind of neat, everything that works together, and you just want, like, a few cameras, and then, well, kind of like there's some advantages to that approach at the end of the day. But of course, if you want to get your data out and do more with it, and like, then that's exactly what you said, that's where sort of
and taking that all the way to like having service providers like completely build something bespoke. You could hire developers to just develop things, which is like the other end of that scale. Is there anyone else you sort of have an eye on in big tech? Like, for example, I know Cisco is doing a bit more in smart buildings with their DNA spaces and
Mhm.
Meraki products. Do you expect more from big tech? Do you expect a response from Microsoft competitors to have similar offerings?
Ooh, good question. Yes, Cisco's just like really interesting. I think I said to you right before when you contacted me, like I remember 2005, they bought like a building systems integrator business in the US called Richard Zeta. And like they, like they didn't really end up doing anything with it. But they kind of, I think, flirted with the idea of, oh, like
Yeah,
what's in this for us? Like, can we get into selling switches and routers for building technology? They didn't really develop that business. And I think that's kind of like one of the things, isn't it? But acquiring companies, acquiring technology, it's not easy, right? When we talked about complexity earlier, being able to integrate, especially with a company of that's like Cisco, like that size, being able to integrate something, some other technology into that stack, or being, even just the data, right? Like if you've got two different databases, how do you manage those things
yeah,
together? How do you onboard the customers, all that kind of stuff. So in that respect, like I think I do not expect like a big tech company to come in and start doing very technical things or taking on some of the hardware or the services around core building technology. But for sure, I see, and it's already happening, them wanting to and partnering with companies on their cloud services. Amazon are taking the same approach as Microsoft in that respect. And I think that will continue. And we haven't mentioned, like Google, for example,
yeah,
is again their sort of approach seems to be slightly different. I don't get the feeling they are very, very good at again their own. They're very serious about their own technology. They're in their own buildings and using that to optimize their space. I think they see that as a really unique selling point to bring in the best talent and the best knowledge into their business.
yeah.
And they've created some interesting. They are prepared to talk about it and provide or like tell people how their approach to doing smart buildings at scale. And they've open sourced
Yeah.
some interesting things as well.
That they also have.
Um,
I
sorry.
was coincidentally at a
Yeah.
Google event last night.
Okay.
Actually, the notepad I'm holding right now is a Chrome OS
Nice.
branded notepad. And on that, Chrome OS, I think has a foot in the door with smart buildings,
Yeah.
just sort of flirting with it with kiosks and digital signage.
Okay.
Um, and their Chrome OS on devices is just like this secure, lightweight operating system that is sort of purpose built for running kiosks and interfaces. And that growth, I sort of feel like they're being just in the background. A lot of people don't know about it. They might know
Mm,
about the Chromebooks that students use, for example,
yeah.
but there's enterprise version of Chrome OS that powers a lot of digital signage and kiosks. So that could be a starting point for them or their partner ecosystem.
Right. Yeah, for sure. Um, yeah, and I think that's the kind of thing where I think they exert their influence, right? So we mentioned before about the cloud services. Absolutely, they want to grow that part of the business, the operating system side of it. They want to grow that business. Are they actually going to go and produce, let's say, a workplace management application or a tenant experience application? I don't think so. No, they're just going
Yeah,
they'll just partner with the people to do that and say, come and
yeah.
use our technology stack.
It's interesting though because they there's many direct competing services with Microsoft in the workspace like as in like Google Hangout or Google Meet that it's called now, Google Meet. And the chat around that, similar to Microsoft Teams, the thread-based, channel-based chat Google has, and just little hints at like working from home and hybrid work features within those products. Even in the calendar system, you can set your work
Mm.
from home days, so your team know where you are and what rooms to book, etc. So it's like, yeah, it's like they're sort of showing signs that they're thinking about this. I'm going to be interested to see how directly they respond to Microsoft releasing a like essentially a workplace management platform. Um, but yeah, I think this has been
Contradicted himself, didn't he?
yeah,
I think what I guess I'm trying to say is they will, yes, they're interested in the workplace and that hybrid element of it. And we could
yeah,
talk about, like, the how it's the physical meets the digital, isn't it? And I think, yes, they want to own that space, and they can see that. I think what my point was is like more about the actual systems, right?
yeah,
That's where I think that they're not going to see it's
yeah,
just not enough business for them.
yeah. We'll see. Because I'm just thinking out loud here. There's also other little gems like they were a major backer of some of the communication protocols for devices, Thread,
Mhm. Oh
um,
yeah, yeah. There's Matin
which
now.
has graduated to something else now. They don't call it Thread anymore. I haven't been following that
Matin.
project. Yeah, but there's like, and they're so sort of dominant in the home automation market that there might be some transferable things there in
Mm,
combination with their workplace focus. And what I've seen, working a, a little bit with Google and a little bit with Microsoft and projects, um, Google seem to have that advantage of running more like startup mode, smaller teams that can cross over and just like not be so department driven.
mm,
Where it only, I mean, and if we look at Google had Sidewalk Labs, well, they still do, don't they? Sidewalk Labs is a Google or Alphabet company,
mhm,
which was a smart city focus.
mhm.
Um, there's all the elements there that just need to sort of come together.
They certainly have yeah, a lot of different parts of that business is that's certainly tangentially around kind of like, the core of smart buildings.
Yeah. Well, yeah,
Yeah.
I think this has been a great conversation. I uh, I was saying to my wife that works in fashion, and her sort of strategy for her business is finding influencers in the industry. And I think you're like one of the only influencers in, in our industry. um, when
Thank
I see your articles and you're very active on LinkedIn, and if I'm ever saying anything that sounds smart, it's probably because I read it on your website or your LinkedIn first.
Well, that's very generous of you. Thanks, John.
Um, so and we mentioned a few research papers in this course, so I just encourage anyone to check it out, and
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
I'll
we
leave
wrote
some links.
something recently on cybersecurity. That's something that we haven't even touched on. I think that's a massive
Yeah.
issue at the moment. Like some really interesting things came out of that research, like actually around like the risk and the appetite for risk now from insurers. And what you're
Mm,
seeing actually is insurers, in a sort of in a typical building policy now, they're removing cybersecurity from it. And that's something that some building owners probably don't realize, and may well be kind of self-insuring at this point and not have cover for cyber attack.